Hello everybody, Brian Hussar here. For my new subscribers, on this channel I talk about my passions of the Beatles, music, movies, and musical theater. If you like what you see, please hit that subscribe button and spread the word. And if you like this video, please give me a big ol' thumbs up. Did John Lennon really want to end the Beatles? Did John Lennon really want to quit the Beatles? This is a question that I've kept asking myself for a long time, and I think I found my own answer. These are theories that I have. I'm not presenting any of these as fact. These are theories based on interviews, based on articles, based on interviews from all four members, based on interviews with Yoko. Did John want to leave the Beatles? Now we know what happened that fateful day before Abbey Road came out, the meeting that happened at Apple. We heard John talk about it, we've heard Paul talk about it. George wasn't at that meeting, he was out of town. But where John told everybody that, he wants a divorce, or this is like a divorce, I'm leaving the group. In John's point of view, he kept saying no to everything Paul had said. And then John said, I wasn't going to tell you this, but I'm leaving the group. In Paul's eyes, John lashed out at him and said, I think you're daft. In fact, I wasn't going to fucking tell you this, I'm leaving the fucking group. Or something like that, to that effect. Yoko has said in interviews that she freaked out because John told her after they left the meeting, I was with those guys now I'm with you. But what was John truly thinking? There's a brilliant article in Rolling Stone that came out in 2009 around the time of the remasters that goes through all of these theories based on interviews and based on things that have been discussed. And this is where I started to formulate my opinion. I don't think John clearly wanted to leave the Beatles. I think John was using this as a power play. Sure, he wanted some time off. Sure, he wanted to do his own album and do a couple of his own solo albums, but I'm sure John was going to use this for leverage. In a year or 2 years, get the guys back together. I am sure John didn't think Paul was going to do what he did. I know John had said in interviews that he was told by Alan Klein not to say anything to the public and blah, 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 blah. And we all know that it was Paul who gave the news that the Beatles had broken up via his press release in the McCartney album. That pissed John off. Now, John had said he was pissed and hurt by it because Paul didn't tell me he was going to do that. But if you really wanted out of the band, why would you even give two cares about it? That's my opinion. Why would you really care, and why would you really go after Paul the way you did? Now, Paul took them to court. He was unhappy with Alan Klein. He wanted to get out of that deal. And by doing that, he had to take all four members of the Beatles to court to dissolve their partnership. The one thing I will say on Paul's side in this video is I wish somebody could explain to me why Paul, after all these years, is saying because of what he did, it saved the Beatles' empire. I don't see it. But Paul, rightfully so, felt he was being done in. John, George, and Ringo sort of formed a big alliance against Paul, and they really made Paul seem like the bad guy. But prior to the McCartney album coming out, John in interviews in early 1970 was still going on like the Beatles were an active thing. Yes, he said, I was told not to say anything. But John was professional enough at that point to know how to give an answer, I would think. But no, he was saying things like, we're planning on touring. We're going to do some concerts. This is going to be a rebirth. Read some of the interviews in early 1970. He's saying those things. This is going to be a rebirth. We're going to do some concerts. We're planning on getting back in the studio. I think in May we're going to be getting in the studio or something to that effect. I'm sorry. Somebody who really wants out of the band wouldn't be giving interviews like that. And even when they were going to court, all three gave their depositions. Now legally, you could say they did this to be in a better legal position against Paul, but they were unified in their statements that we don't want the Beatles to end. We just want Paul to stop being dominating. They've all basically said things to that effect. But the way John acted, the hurt that he felt, I'm sorry, if somebody really wanted out of the band and he was the one who told everybody I want a divorce, and in the Rolling Stone interview in late 1970, he said, I started the band, I disbanded it. That's that. Okay, fine, you wanted out of the band. Why do you care what Paul says? Why do you care what Paul did? Why do you care that Paul made the announcement that the Beatles are done? Yes, John also said, well, I was upset that he did it for publicity for his solo album. I should have done that. The theory being on John's side, John wanted to be the one to tell the world. But I think it's a bit more complicated than that. Because in 74, when the final dissolution paperwork came up, 74 or 75, whatever year it was, you see it in the Martin Scorsese documentary on George Harrison, where Paul and George are in the hotel room in New York signing the paperwork. Supposedly Ringo was there as well. They were all there. They were waiting for John. John didn't show up. John did not show up to the hotel meeting to sign the final dissolution paperwork. Granted, he said there were a lot of financial things that he felt they didn't work out, but he eventually signed them in Disney World. Was it truly that? Or was it that John really didn't want this to end? And by signing the final dissolution paperwork, it truly meant this was going to be the end of the band that he started. I think John didn't want it to end, and John wanted to be the one to call the shots and say, all right, guys, we're all getting back together again. Check out 1974. In interviews, he's saying, yeah, I could play with all of them again. I think we can do it, you know. I don't see us touring, but I see us recording. I see us really doing something and saying something. He was giving interviews to that effect. It wasn't reciprocated, especially by George. I know Paul and John hung out in LA, and John and Ringo were hanging out, but it wasn't really reciprocated. You know, Paul was selling a lot of records. He finally separated himself from the Beatles because Wings was popular. 75 comes. He releases Venus and Mars, and they start making plans for their big tours in Europe and America. George just came off a pretty successful tour as far as attendance, not successful as far as critics were concerned, but that's two different things. He didn't get a response back. I think John wanted to control when the Beatles were going to get back together again and when they were not going to be Beatles, and the fact that it was now out of his control hurt him. That's my theory. Like I said, if you want out of a band and you're the one who disbands, who cares how the world knows? So Paul told people that the Beatles were breaking up. Big deal. Paul took them to court to dissolve the partnership. Well, you wanted the group to end. You wanted the group to end, John. It was the breakup that you wanted. That's why I think in the Beatles story, especially concerning the breakup, it is a lot more complicated than we will ever know. My theory again is that John wanted to control when the Beatles were going to break up and when they were going to get back together. And by signing the final dissolution paperwork, that meant it was truly going to be over. The other question is, what would have happened if Paul, George, and Ringo told John, that's great, John, go off on your own. We still want to be the Beatles. In fact, we're going in the studio in 1970. We're going to do some solo albums, and we're going to do Beatles stuff and tour. And they went ahead and did a David Gilmour, Nick Mason, and Rick Wright of Pink Floyd. But that's a story for another video. But that's my video on the theory of, and the question of, did John really want to leave the Beatles? I want to know your thoughts on this. This is a really complicated subject. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. Please keep them professional. I'll try to answer as many as I can. Thank you so much for watching this video. And as always, until we meet again.